And with that, Nora, could you introduce yourself and then I'll introduce our first segment?
Okay. Um, well, first of all, hello, and it's really nice to be here. I'm looking forward to seeing where this goes today. And as I was just saying to Tom earlier, it's really nice because he really did the reading. And I so respect and appreciate the integrity of that. So I'm looking forward to that. And one of the things that happens when people don't read first is that they're sometimes questioning and discussion happening at an easier access spot. So I just want to open into the room also that Tom's already in the deep end of the pool. So I want to be sure to keep this open and be careful that we keep it on the ground. So if it starts to feel like we're drifting into some jargony space, please remind us to keep it on the ground. And as for introducing myself, well, that is a bit of a trick question. And it's kind of at the heart of all of this work and everything that we're going to be talking about today. Who am I, and who are you, and how have the last several hundred years of epistemological, cultural, educational, not to mention religious, etc., context shaped the idea of who I am and who you are, and how do we make those assessments? And how is that different than a meadow? In what ways are those ways of identifying ourselves part of what is separating us from looking at the world and, in fact, ourselves in a more ecological way? So I want to throw that question back to you and say, I'm not sure yet. I don't know who I can be when I'm with you. I can give you a list of my achievements and my thises and my that's, and I'm not sure that's really very interesting. It might make you feel like I'm more or less credible. I've made movies, I've written books, I've taught courses, I create processes, I've done all sorts of things. More importantly, who can I be in this conversation, and what can we bring out together? And that, I think, for me, has been a real shift from even just, hanging out as I did as a child in the 70s in California, in the midst of the self-help world, the beginning of that whole genre. And it was all about the individual and the bettering of the individual. And this, for me, well, first of all, as a child, it was pretty transparent that most of it was nonsense, because I saw a lot of adults who really wanted to do the right thing. They learned all the right words and they learned how to sit just perfect like they were meditating, but they were still jerks to the kids. And so I became pretty clear the development of the individual is not necessarily the whole picture. And so what is it that I can do in relationship with you, Tom, for example, that allows you to be in another way? So how can I make space for your complexity? It's not just your intellect or your professional self, but yourself as a friend, yourself as somebody who walks in the woods, somebody who has had their heart broken, somebody who has things that they love and treasure and has gone through several decades of life. So how to be in relationship so that those aspects of ourselves are not held back in some way that limits the way we can think together, feel together, sense together. So that's my tricky answer to, can you introduce yourself?
I I love it as an illustration of the struggle with language and meaning or meaning making that certainly in my work I've come up with. How do I find the right words to say this thing that's in reality? And the words, I had to come to terms with the fact that the words will always fall short. And I love that about what I hear from you too, Nora, is that the reality is, I think you said the menu is not the meal. That the reality just isn't served sometimes by its description.
Mm-mm. No, and it's very easy to actually commit that violence of a reductive description in the hopes that it will give somebody a few cultural cues and codes to place me in a few different compartments so they have some idea, and that's supposed to actually make it easier. But in fact, what it does is it obscures the messy, complex aspect of actually what's happening in our relationship right now. Are we in competition? Are we opening things up? Are we in investigation? Or do we trust each other? Are we like, where are we? And I think that is the sensitivity for me. That is the sense making. That is the sensitizing that I'm looking for, to not look for the reductive description, but to become much more attentive to what are the possibilities that are emerging in the relational process. That's what my whole book is basically about.
Yeah, we're done.
Okay, that was easy.
uh, I'm just going to tie back to two recent voices sessions that we had because you're reminding me of them. One was the last one we had with a woman named Sheena Mason on race and racelessness and the construct of race as a limiting factor for everyone involved in those discussions. And I'll go back to a session we had earlier in this fall season with Paul Crick, who's our elephant watcher today, on affordances. And my takeaway from that was pretty profound because of how fundamental I saw the fact that we have to make sense of things and we force ourselves to make sense of things because we need those affordances in that sentence. And so that's like most human things has a helpful part to it. It helps us get some ground, but it also has a limiting part to it where we are too attached to those or too premature with those that sense making, and then close ourselves off to what might be there beyond that.
It's easy to do. It's actually difficult to not do. So that's the assumption that you know somebody is an interesting assumption, because on the one hand, there is this possibility of connection that is something like a birthright of just being alive. And that sense of connection is very easily confused with a set of definitions and categories. So I feel that it's necessary to be as humble as possible in that and say, I don't know who you are. So, and I don't know who I am when I'm with you. And coming from there, we can begin to be in a different tonality rather than a sort of bloom of accolades or various familiar tags that would place me in familiar boxes. And I, I'm sure that there are ways in which I am in those familiar boxes. But the truth of the matter is I'm changing. I'm thinking about that moment, with Alice, when the caterpillar says, "Who are you?" And she says, "Well, I hardly know, because I'm changing so much lately." And in this moment where everybody, well, not everybody, but a lot of people are really hoping for significant change, significant shift in our thinking, significant shift in the way we're living, doing. It seems to me this is actually critical, that there be an allowance, an affordance, a possibility of giving each other room to not know who we are while we are figuring out who we are together. And as we're both changing, this is an infinite project. And isn't that nice?
Yeah. So there's a bunch of ways to look at this, or perspectives. And one of them is our own self-understanding and understanding ourselves differently, and the fact that we are in fact changing. And the other is how our being in the world in fact is creating experience or changing others, and receiving uh, that transformation back from those engagements.
Mm-hmm.
uh, I'm trying to keep to our time, because this is just really going to prime a lot of conversations, hopefully. But the thing that I also found in your book that is part of your story is this idea of uh, shifting from kind of our institutional self, our subject self, to ourself as part of more things. The your observations about our existence in the world, and that we're not an isolated organism, but we're in fact an echo organism. Can you tell us about that perspective a little bit?
Absolutely. And again, I think I'm looking into that space because I'm curious around, where's the edge of me? And if I start to ask, where is the edge of me, or where is the edge of you? The question gets fairly murky. Am I just this contained set of organs and fluids? Am I my ideas? Am I my culture? Am I my, a continuation of ancestral ideas and habits? Am I my generation? Am I actually, some very small fraction of your cells in your body are even human. Most of them, by a long shot, something, in the 80 or 90% range of the cells in your body belong to other bacterial and other organisms. So who are you? And when you look at that, there is a whole ecology of contextual process that is actually forming us in every moment. Thinking about, for example, if you had been born 15,000 years ago, what would your hands do in a day? What would they do in a day? Well, they probably wouldn't send text messages, and they probably wouldn't tap on laptops, and they probably wouldn't drive cars, and they probably wouldn't turn on microwaves, or right. Most of the things that we do with our hands, even turning on the faucet in the sink, are far away from the experience that our ancestors had. And if you were born in the mountains in I don't know, in South America, what would your hands do in a day? If you were born in the jungle or the desert, what would your hands do? And I'm asking that because I think it's important to recognize that there are lots of possibilities for what it is to be human. And that those possibilities, keeping that in mind, you recognize there is no is here. And when people say that's just how it is, or this is some sort of hardened natural fact, I think it's very important, especially now, to keep that loose. Well, how is it? How could it be? We don't know. There's another aspect of the self, which is this notion of the ecology of selves. And so that's another piece of this where when I was writing Combining, I was really very careful to be sure that I was not only speaking to many aspects of you, but speaking from many aspects of me. So the book has a lot of different kinds of pieces in it. Some are gritty and theoretical and you know, meaty and researched, and some are stories and poetry, and some are sexy, and some are despairing, and some are lyrical, and there are different rhythms, different textures, different flavors, different ways in which the book is speaking to you emotionally, intellectually, as a lover, as a friend, as a, you know, father, as a son, as a, right. So I'm recognizing that in contrast, okay, so often what I perceive and experience is that I go to, say, a conference on, say, I don't know, climate change or mental health for kids, or and in that conference there is no ecology of communication. There's a monocropping. And because the communication gets monocropped, it actually only meets us, because we are ecologies, in a monocropped way. So there's a real risk of a kind of reductionism of texture, tones, tempo, rhythm, and sort of the hum that needs to take place in order to make communication between and among and with us. So I'm hoping to speak from my ecology of selves to your ecology of selves.
Yeah. So thank you. And so right now we're going to take a little breakout, our icebreaker, which we normally do right at the beginning. But what we want to do is pair people up in twos and just have them meet each other. And our prompt for this one is maybe how do you see yourself apart from things or apart from your past? How do you see yourself more broadly as a fixed thing? And then just get to meet the other person that you meet in the room today. And Jonathan's setting that up. Well, welcome back, everyone. I know that's just not enough time, and I know people are they don't join the room, and so you're there alone. It's all part of our messy world. Next breakout will be a little bit longer, and we're going to put you in a little bit larger groups, and so hopefully you know, people will be attentive and join in and engage in that group. But you know, when we want to switch topics a little bit, they're all interwoven. But I want to talk a little bit about just making sense of things. You know, this idea of stitching between context, trans contextual stitching. I love that idea, and I'd like to understand more about what that means to you, Nora.
Okay. Well, I think it's where we're making a lot of mistakes, is in thinking that things are not stitching. And I noticed that I didn't say stitched. So this ongoing overlapping, interweaving, intersteeping, interstitching of culture, of family, of economy, of ways of responding to everything from, you know, the law or your identity or history. And so noticing these multiple ways in which contexts come together, and that there is movement there. Okay, this is so incredible to me. We're living in a moment where, if you look at most of the crises that are stacked up in what Daniel Schmachtenberger calls the meta crisis, and I call the poly crisis, and people call the omni crisis, or whatever you want to call it, crisis, the multi crisis. Basically, any aspect of that appears to be impossible. You know, if you look at the history of the war with Israel and Gaza, there's no, like, how are you going to ever sort that out? It's impossible. If you look at the situation with the particulate in the atmosphere and the need for transportation and economy, and how that's all contributing to the ecological disaster, how are you going to undo that? If you look at the way in which the education system is actually pushing our children into the same exact system that we're all trying to change, and how would you change an education system? And in every way, there's this blockage. And I think that blockage is basically a message that says you cannot do this in this spot. You have to move into another way of looking at how multiple contexts are coming together. So, you know, it would be nice if you could just change the education system. But the education system is actually a reflection, maybe even a description of the economic system. It's actually a description of family expectations across generations of what is survival and identity in next generations. The education system is an expression of political and legal structures that run right the way through our entire society. So where's the education system? All right. So from this place, I started to ask questions around, how do these systemic processes actually shift? How do they learn? I'll give you an example, because I want to come back to this notion of transcontextual process. But if you look at how you might learn to play violin, and you say, okay, well, I might learn by my muscles. This could be a muscular learning. I might learn intellectually. I might learn about the theory of the music, and I might learn, might be my mind telling my muscles. I might learn in my relationship to the violin teacher. I might learn in relationship to culture. Okay, what's my relationship to the music itself? Am I learning Bach? Am I learning to play bluegrass? What's my relationship to this instrument? It might be a relationship to the music itself and an emotional connection. And I think you probably know what I'm talking about when I say there are people who have, technically, they've got everything, but something's missing. And if you've ever learned to play an instrument, you might know that I'm sure you've had the experience of having some sort of emotional experience that then somehow brings information into your body and into relationship with the instrument. You break your heart, and then you can play that song. So where's the learning? Okay. And I want you to think about that, because it's pretty clear that it's in the combining of those, right? It is in your muscles and in your body. It is in your emotions. It is intellectual. It is in relationship to the teacher. It is in the relationship to the instrument itself, to the culture. All of those things are combining multiple contexts of different communications coming together. Now, if you want to study how you learn to play violin, you're probably going to start pulling them apart. Here's the muscular learning. Here's the intellectual learning. Here's the emotional learning. And when you do that, there's something absolutely critical that's going to get lost, which is, how are they shifting each other? That piece of that place, how does my muscle learning shift my intellectual learning, shift my emotional sensitivities, shift my, right? So, and not to mention how learning the violin might shift other parts of your life. It might make you a more dedicated jogger. It might make you more sensitive in your writing. It could make you sleep better, right? So there's all sorts of multi-contextual processes that are taking place all the time. And so for me, I think this word transcontextual is a word that my father coined. And it has given me so much lift in my work and in my thinking, where I might have used words like transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary or even intersectional. The thing with transcontextual is it's really looking at how the contexts are shaping each other, getting into this abductive process. Okay, this is this field of study that comes from Charles Saunders Peirce, who was looking at different kinds of logic. And one of the kinds of logic he's talking about is where you learn something in one context and you take that learning and you apply it in another context. You hypothesize. And in that hypothesis, there's a gap. All right? It's not a straight continuum, it's a gap. So I'm going to hypothesize this, which means I'm probably wrong, at least a little bit. And that's great news. It's great news because it makes room for things to happen. In that little bit of confusion, there is the possibility for change, for shifting, for learning, for confusion, for relationships to be in motion. And I think again and again, I'm going to keep coming back to this. The moving is what is important, how to keep the pieces moving. We're so used to thinking in industrial terms in which all of the parts of a system are parts and they have thresholds. And we can talk more about abductive process and if Tom wants to ask more questions.
Well, I do. So this is how I'm imagining what you're describing about this gap is that I might move from one context to another. And part of the gap is what I don't know about that other context. But part of the gap is just by opening that relationship to the other context, there's gap that I hadn't seen before. And is that what you mean by gap, or are you thinking of that and something else? Tell me more about the gap.
I mean, I think the gap can take a lot of different shapes and forms and can come from many different directions. It's a basic misunderstanding sometimes. It's applying my way of perceiving to something that's happening, and my way of perceiving is just limited to what my experience is. So, you know, I could hear a piece of music, and what I hear in the music is something that comes from my experience.
Yeah.
Right. And so I make a connection, but there's a lot missing in that. And what is so beautiful is that I can listen to that piece of music 100 times. And as I am changing, what I hear changes.
Yes. Interesting. And I don't mean to, I'm rushing a little. I
Mm.
hate it, because I'd love to just, spend hours on each of these topics. But to me, this is knitted together when I think of your themes that I read from you. This idea of learning and understanding and knowing and evolving is related to this idea of abductive reasoning or hypothesis, but also to this idea of warm data, I think, and what's knowable, what's fact, what's valuable knowledge. Try to tell so abductive reasoning, I claim in my own things that I've written, is exactly are trying to make sense across the different thoughts and disciplines and experiences of who leaders are and what leaders do. And so how can you take all those things that aren't reconciled and hypothesize something that makes sense from them. And that's how I think of the abductive process. But I'm wondering if you see it
Hmm.
a different way. And then I run into all the time, just this week, in a conversation with a really smart guy about, what truth is, what fact is, what actionable data is versus inactionable data from kind of one camp versus others who are very invested in intuition and instinct and somatics and that part of what's fact and actionable. So I'm sorry that's such a broad thing. Give us a few of your perspectives on all of that.
Okay, well, first let's go back to abductive process because now we've opened it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I think one way to think about it that my dad invites, which is a little different than Charles Saunders Peirce, is that instead of thinking of it as a hypothesis, think of it as a description. Okay, so if you think of, let's make an imaginary forest in our minds for just a moment, and think of the way in which a tree, you can look at it as a tree and go, there it is, that's a tree. Now, back up and start to ask the question, how is this tree a description of the soil and the bacteria in the soil? And you can start to see that there is a way in which the tree and the soil are describing each other. Okay, and then you can look at, say, a squirrel. And you can ask yourself, how is this squirrel a description of the tree that it lives in, that it eats from? And how is the tree describing the squirrel? And what you start to see in an ecological system is that all of the organisms become, in this living abductive process, descriptions of each other. Okay, you can't have a tree without bacteria in the soil. You can't have bacteria in the soil without the poop from the rodents, and without the decomposing leaves, and without the change of the seasons and the moving of the water, and right. So the insects, all of these things become a way of looking at each other. Now that is a really unwelcome idea into the sphere of making some sort of management of complex systems, because it actually shifts the approach that's possible. How do you come into a world in which all of these different moving, changing, ever growing, ever learning elements, the trees, the squirrels, the bacteria, the birds, the insects, the mosses, the ferns, are all shifting. And they're all in some way a description of each other. And when you take things out of that ecosystem, the descriptions change, the shapes change, the form, literally the form changes. So when we think about information, we're looking at form. Warm data is recognizing that there is something that cannot be grabbed. And that something is very important information. It's the something that actually makes it possible to play a violin, or actually makes it possible for there to be a forest. But you can't actually pull everything apart and find it. Much like my body, if you take all my pieces apart, you won't find me. I'm somewhere else, but I'm definitely real. Here I am, I'm here, but you can't find me in my parts. Like a family, you can't find a family in the parts. The family is there in the relationship. So looking at this way in which ecologies are doing this I mean, it's such an incredibly beautiful thing. We call it evolution, we call it life. But in order for a forest or a meadow to keep making forests and meadows, every organism has to change. They're constantly in response to each other. If they're not, they're going to become obsolete. And sometimes those movements are, those shiftings are swift, and sometimes they take hundreds of years. They're on different timelines. So this way of recognizing abductive process, and to make it easy, I'm sticking it in a forest, because if I actually point it back at us, well, I get in trouble when I do that.
Yeah.
Because it makes it very difficult to describe what development is.
Yeah.
Where is the development happening?
Let's look at this one brief more time. Let's narrow the frame to the context where I'm in a conversation with a person, or I'm teaching a class, or I'm holding a meeting at an organization or a training session, or I'm having a coaching conversation. What is happening? What is warm data? How is warm data important to me in those conversations or in those settings?
Well, yeah. Okay. So I think one thing that's really highly underestimated is how much is assumed and encoded. This is something that I think working with people who are perceiving things in another way, whether that's because they're from another culture or they have different neurological ways of dealing with information and input, or they're in a completely different age, right? Talking to babies. And I had an experience that illustrated this for me very profoundly a couple of years ago. I live in Sweden and I'm not Swedish, so I'm constantly dealing with the culture thing. But this one was an invitation that I got into a tea house where there were the geisha, and it was such an honor to be invited. And I wasn't prepared for it. I had to run across town to make it over there. It was 40 degrees Celsius outside. I was sticky and sweaty and wearing the absolute worst pink dress you can imagine. And I walked stinky, sweaty, enormous Caucasian woman into this tea house where everything was like completely, every detail had been cared for, and I felt like the biggest mess. And as I sat down, I realized I was in a room where there were thousands of codes, and I didn't know them. I didn't know what to do with my eyes. I didn't know how to hold my mouth. I didn't know what to do with my hands. I didn't know what to do with my feet. I didn't know whether I should eat first or eat last. I didn't know who should bow to who. I didn't know if I should smile showing my teeth or not showing my teeth. I didn't know when to make eye contact. I didn't know whether I should talking about personal things or not personal things, political things or not political things. I had absolutely no idea of the codes. And in that moment, I also realized how many codes I do know. So when I'm sitting at a restaurant and someone walks in that I know, there's a whole lot of already existing communication processes that we're in that say, okay, stand up and go meet your friend and meet them at the door so they can go to their table because obviously they're on a date, or invite them to come sit with you, or don't invite them, or right there's and we are actually, sometimes clumsily, but nevertheless, we are navigating through thousands of these invisible communication limitations, structures, tonality shapers that are telling us always we're inside of a grouping of communication limitations. Nothing wrong with limitations, except that if you forget. So when you're asking it, when you and I are talking, what's there in the warm data? And part of what's there is these worlds of experience coming together through language, which is its own wild thing, in through our ideas, our experiences, our feelings, in our coded relational processes, in what it's okay to say, who it's okay to be, who can you be with me, is another way of saying, what's it possible to communicate here? And where are those limits held? If we want to really shift the possibilities for behavior, for action, then where are the limits held? Okay, so this comes right back to that forest and the abductive process. Who is it possible to be? When you look at that tree and you say, how is it learning to be in its world? That question is going to actually provoke an approach to perceiving the tree that is not just the tree. It's going to, you're going to have to look at how that tree is learning to be because of where the nutrients are in the soil and the bacteria that have produced those nutrients. It's going to have to look at where the water is, or the other shadows, or the other organisms, and how they're shaping each other. Which is not to say that the tree is not a tree. The tree is still a tree. And the tree is doing what it's doing, and all the organisms around it are all learning to be together. But I think what's important about this warm data piece is that there's a lot of information in that improvisation that's happening between all those organisms. There's a lot of improvisation in the way that you and I are even talking right now. And that in that possibility, the information is not what was said or not said. Okay, which we could easily say, okay, the information that we're looking for is on the transcript. This is what they said. But this is not what they said. So then you can think, okay, so what was it not possible to say? Who was it not possible to be? And then you start to see that there's this other place where ecological limitations are shifting. And that for me is really interesting. I want to read you something from combining. I'm just thinking of this piece.
While you're finding it, we'll do that, and then we're going to do a break, which I'll set up. So let's go with what you're going to read.
All right. I'm going to read actually two tiny pieces. Okay. So this is the book combining. This piece is called To Live in Another Way. At first, it appears that it is the parts of the system that must be made better or fixed. Then it becomes clear that the system is not in the parts. It's in the relationships between them. So it seems like it's the relationships that need to be made better or fixed. But relationships, it turns out, are made of communication. And then the communication becomes the place to address the needed adaptations. And then you realize what's communicated is not what is expressed or even what is not expressed. It's what it was possible to express. That's a really important way to think about communication. That is where the limits move in the combining. How shall I tend to the premises of what is possible to communicate? And Dave Pendell asked if the last sentence there, I'll just read it again. How
Sure.
shall I tend to the premises of what is possible to communicate? How shall I tend to the premises of what is possible to communicate? Which is something very different than coming up with a new script.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, enjoy. What was the question that we're supposed to ask in this breakout?
You don't have a breakout question. It's
Oh,
just
good.
try
Okay.
to share with each other what your understanding is and questions that you have. It's
Whew,
a
that's
way
good.
for people to process. Well, they're
Great.
knitting. They're stitching.
Good.
And Nora has so many things that she can communicate. So I'm sorry we're rushing through these things and it's too much to absorb. It's more like a survey course in Nora's thinking than it is a detail course. But this last segment to me is about the one there's a lot of energy around, which is how do we change? How do we instantiate change? How do we create in the world? And why do we even need to? And it's themes from Nora's book that I love is this idea of readying. And in our Prometheus framework, we talk about action being setting conditions and actually achieving things or doing results as different perspectives and relationships. But so readying and tending, emergence versus submergence, right? These types of themes about how do we, and it could be the big things like social justice and sustainability, but also narrowing the frame. How do we just change the conversation that we're having sometimes, or that we want to have sometimes as well?
Well, first of all, I want to look at what is behind your question,
Hmm.
which is, I think, the feeling, the sense of double binds, this feeling that there's something that can't move, which is all, of course, an illusion because everything is moving anyway. But there is the sensation that I am caught. We are caught. There is a trap. There is something that we cannot move. Or if we move this way, we break that. And if we move this way, we break that.
The tautology. How do we break the tautology? Yeah.
And so the sense of this, the other thing I want to do is I want to replace the word change with learning. What if we just started there? Let's just say all learning is change.
Mm-hmm. All leading is learning, I would say.
All
Yeah.
change is learning.
Yeah.
So there's always, you may not be learning something good, or whatever good is. You could be learning to lie or cheat or hold back or, be destructive or, right? We learn to do those things. We learn to be crooked trees. So I think what you're asking, and I'm going to rephrase it and see if you agree with me, okay, is right now, it would be a mistake, okay, to say that we decontextualize things to make sense of them, because actually what we're doing is we're recontextualizing them into a world in which decontextualized processes make sense. Because if you look at a machine, it works that way. You can replace the parts, you can fix them, you can improve them, you can do whatever you need to do with them. So the compartmentalized process is a context. It is an ecology of epistemological ideas, and they are framing each other. They're alive and working together through multiple contexts of our lives. This is the issue. The issue is not that the thinking is in some way decontextualized. The problem is that it is. It is an ecology of institutional processes that are interdependent and so on. So this is important because I think where I want to go with responding to your question is to the recognition that what is happening, coming back to abductive process, is that these relationships are shaping each other. So if you, in warm data work, what we are working with is not how to change the parts, but how to allow for different movement and reflections to take place between them. Now, I can't control that movement. That is a wild place. So we put lots of context side by side and let people tell stories and talk about things and let them connect. And this stitchery, this connective process that takes place is not mine to guide. I do not know what will happen. I don't know who you sat with. I don't know what context you were in. I don't know what stories they told. I have no idea. But what I do know is that if you put a lot of different things side by side and let them start to make reflections, that there is learning, that it becomes possible to perceive things from directions and through context you didn't see it before. And in that, there is movement. So it's a problem in any, okay, I don't know how deep do you want to go into tautology today? Because this is not an easy one.
I think it's probably something that a lot of people haven't spent much time thinking about. So just take us anywhere and we will be richer.
Okay. So the word tautology, we probably learned about it in English class or in some sort of language class. If you weren't in an English speaking school, then you probably learned about it, whatever your language is. Where you get some sort of recursive repetition, the night was dark, right? So you can't, and your teacher says you can't say that. That's a tautology. So, but let's go beyond that expression of it, because that's not really very useful. And interestingly enough, the person who brought tautology in to logical thinking was, of course, Charles Sanders Peirce. Now, if abductive process is how the new comes in, tautology is how you keep it out. So what we're looking at is the problem of this. Let's go back to our forest, all right? Now, if every organism in the forest does only what it does ever, and it only does that thing and it doesn't change, then all the other organisms don't change, and actually nothing learns and nothing moves, and of course it dies, right? So if you do not have ongoing change, you're going to have obsolescence. However, ecologies prefer to continue. And the continuing means that they prefer to be conservative, if you will, because if everything changes and all the relationships break. So tautology is a really interesting, I think, an important word to be bringing in now, because it's referring to those ways in which different aspects of a series of an environment are holding each other in place. How rigid is it? How rigid is it? And where is that rigidity held? So if now in a forest, there are long-term continuances going on. I'm from California, where you get the great redwoods that are 3,000 and 4,000 years old. That's a long story. And then you look at the way in which For example, further down the coast, the way the Pacific Ocean is changing temperature and the different organisms that are learning how to live in a new temperature quickly. They're adapting. So when you're in a world that is in rapid change, the question of how mutual learning can take place between organisms becomes the critical question. How does mutual learning take place between us, among us? Which is not necessarily that we're all learning the same thing, but that we're all learning together. So when we're faced with an event that we've never faced before, we're going to have to be able to respond in ways we've never responded before. And that comes back to this quote from the book of you can't do this unless you can commune. The communication in this process holds the potentiality for mutual learning. So looking at tautology, I think, is really important, and recognizing that by and large, ecologies like forests and oceans and families would like to be tautological. They kind of want to just stay the same and keep yesterday needs to be like today, it'll be like next month. It'll kind of happen. Only because we are alive, it won't.
Yeah. I think of it in two ways, and help me think about this. One is the tautology as like the echo chambers, the various echo chambers. It's what we're used to. So that's one. And so, is it sufficient for us to stay in those echo chambers, or is it insufficient? And the second is this kind of polarity between, we need enough coherence. We want coherence. We genetically, or DNA, we have to create affordances, and we want to be operational or effective. We want to be agents in the world, so we need to create this. So it's not that it's bad to have that coherence, but what limits us perhaps is to take it too seriously or hold it too firmly, and not recognize that every step we take, or every person we meet, or everything we do invites us to look at that differently and learn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what is happening in that learning, right? So I'm thinking about ways in which I have learned with people in my life. There are things I won't talk about with this person because that topic brings too much pain or too much complication. It's too much work. I don't have time for it. I don't have the emotional morale to deal with it. So I'm not going to talk about it in this space or that space. And I want to point that out as a way of learning, that we also are learning to hold back. And I'm not sure there's anything wrong with that, but just to notice that that is also mutual learning. And so it's not necessarily a good thing. We can mutually learn to co-inhabit an authoritarian space, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a lot of people did not say a word for decades around whatever Harvey Weinstein's rapes. They didn't. What were they learning that made them not speak? What have we learned, and what are we learning that keeps us in our continuums? So I think for me, part of this is also around paying attention to the ghosts of our epistemological past and things that have taken place that are continuing to shape how we think and what we think and what we think a solution is and what we think a problem is and how we identify those things. So there's a lot of possibility to perceive differently. But again, it's only possible if that's possible in a relationship to communicate that. Yeah.
I want to go to one last set of themes, and then we'll open it up for questions, and we'll get clarification on whatever
Yeah.
comes our way. And this is the ideal of submergence and emergence, and maybe your new word, which I don't know how to pronounce, aphanipoetic.
Yeah. Aphanipoesis.
Oh, okay, thank you. What, and again, for my and many people's desire to affect some change or transformation in their world, and our realization that there are some things that we can have, direct action and influence on, but not necessarily all the things that actually affect or allow the things to emerge we wish would emerge.
Yeah. I don't know. I think we have to be really careful. My question is really, I'm very interested in looking at how you can place things side by side, let that connective process take place. So I'm making gaps so that the connection is made by you. Okay, this whole book is a book of pieces that are not, I have never declared the point of the book. The book is created by you through your connective process. So the gaps between the pieces are restitched by you. And restitched tomorrow differently than today. So putting things together is what we do as human beings. We see connections, we see interdependencies, we see relationships. What relationships do we see? Now, when I'm in the tea house, I'm seeing a lot of relationships that I don't have enough familiarity with to put together in any way but through my lenses, my filters. So I don't have the same information that my Japanese friends do. So it's the combining. It comes back to the combining. And so what I'm looking at in that combining is not first order change. Okay, so most of the time we apply agency toward first order change. So we're going to have this problem and we're going to use our agency to solve the problem. And my question is, what does agency look like when it's not directed at first order? When what I'm looking at is, for example, with my own kids, how can I give them the basis, the premises from which they can meet aspects of life I have never met, and already have something with them that will allow them to learn or find their way into new places. All right, I'm asking, how do I actually nurture nth order agency? Okay, this is a very different thing. So even in that question we started with, who can you be when you're with me? Okay, that's not first order. That's what I'm actually asking is, who can I be that will allow you to be in another way? And
Yeah.
that means I have to pay attention to these other orders of relational process.
Yeah, this nth order agency. I think is what we're trying to, and what's maybe unique in terms of leadership theories, in terms of what we're trying to say the action of leading is. It's really, sometimes it can be about first order stuff, and in a small frame it can be about first order stuff, but many times it's more about the nth order.
Mhm.
How do you perceive it, and how do you set that up? It and again, even that setting up, even that nth order work, some of it can be kind of first orderly little bits of things that you can create, and other parts is really
Yeah.
simply opening up the possibility for that stitching to begin.
Yeah. I mean, think about having a dinner party. Okay. You have a dinner party. You don't know what's going to happen at the conversation at the table. But it's really important that you actually get the ingredients to the food that you're making, and you have the plates, and you have the table set.
Yeah, and have
It,
people feel welcome and relaxed and open. Yeah,
yeah, and too much table setting, they're not relaxed, and that will actually shift the conversation. Too little table setting, and they might be uncomfortable. They might withhold.
hmm.
So there's, you are paying attention at second and third order, but very often we forget that we know how to do this, and it sounds like some trick, but it's actually what we know. How are you in relationship with your good friend? What are you communicating in between what you're saying that says, don't worry, I'll be there for you at 4 a.m. when you need me to? You're not saying that directly, but somehow it's implied. And it's this implication, it's this implicating, this that is happening in between the contexts that makes it possible to actually hold each other in another way.
Yeah. So it's time in our agenda where we see where the audience takes us. So people that have some questions, use the raise hand feature. And our friend Vishva, I
Hi,
love
Vishka.
I want you to take a minute and make your question short, because we have a short amount of time. Then I want to see a few more hands up. So Vishva, your question.
So I will, there's so much to read on the screen, but I'll just pose one question from whatever thread I've picked up. The question is, if warm data is the path of the peaceful warrior, or yeah, just knowing what is emerging and what's submerging, what is the art of war in this? What is the equivalent of art of war?
Yeah, okay. So I'm going to answer you with a piece from the book. And it's actually the dedication. Okay. Because what this is an altar. Can I call it that? Because that's something that has these side-by-side pieces: a ceremony, a piece of music, an art piece, in honor of possibilities unfound, unseen. Okay. So the dedication reads, this book is offered to your pheromones that help you fall in love. I give this book to the you of so long ago that felt alone in not fitting into the world people called normal. I offer this work to your one crazy eyebrow hair with a twist of its own. This book is for your breath coming and going unannounced, making you implicit in the same wind that moves the clouds and the trees. I dedicate this book to the way in which you know even as you try to describe a dream, that your words cannot express the vivid realm you encountered there. But you grope for language anyway. These untamed and unmappable phenomena are reminders of uninvited possibilities to be alive together, beyond illusions of control. To these possibilities, I offer everything I am. So that's my answer to your question, Vishwa, is that it's about how we are releasing the possibilities we didn't know we were looking for. Yeah.
So that's our war, our strategy, our war strategy is to release those things. Interesting. Orion.
I heard a lot of music in your solo that you're singing to us. And what that brings up to me is you're inviting us into something. All of us who are here, you're inviting us into something. You're singing a song for us. What is our dance? What are you inviting us to find ensembles to play with? Are you inviting us to dance? Are you inviting us to sing? What is your invitation to us who have come to hear your solo?
Well, I mean, I guess the invitation is to allow these combinings to take place, allow the impressions and the images to form other images, allow thoughts to lead to new thoughts, allow pathways to open to other pathways, allow whatever happens in the next conversation you're in. What will you enter that conversation with rumbling and ruminating through you? So my offering is also an opening into attention to the communication and the perception. Because you're not just saying what you think you're saying, right? We live in a world where there's quite a bit of, but I have the right to speak my mind and da 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 da. Okay, you do. And it's landing in a context. It's landing in a context. And if you blast your mind and you do your barking, and you're in a room full of people who are dealing with histories of abuse, what you say was not what you said. It was where it landed. So there is an attention to the ecology into which your communication lands. You're dropping the nectar of your communication into a teapot of experience. What's already in there will shape the alchemy of what you bring. So how do you want to bring your communication or yourself or what you say, what you don't say, how you are into the conversation you have after this that allows for there to be a shift? Or not. It's up to you.
Thank you.
As a moderator, I've skipped over something. I'm going to take this as the perfect time to introduce really what we call our commercial break very briefly. So I just want to share real quickly. I'll put a link in the screen. Sorry, our Voices calendar for future events. And speaking of combining, I guess I think of the purpose of these Voices sessions to be combining experiences. We try to bring quite different voices together who rarely get the chance to have a conversation and try to set the conditions for that conversation to take place. So after Nora today, we have a break for the holiday. We start up again in January. We have some interesting sessions. These two here, are around the Prometheus framework. This is about the lessons of Aikido in terms of how we work in the world and see ourselves. Rolf Dane here is about deep personal psychology stuff. We have some culture crafting going on from Jonathan and Wayne Buchanan, who we've had before. And we have some others coming in later in the year through June that we're still negotiating dates and narrowing topics. But I will just share that for you. And please do come. We don't have an advertising budget, so we're word of mouth. So please do help bring other voices into these sessions. And Nora, you have a book, you have warm data lab facilitation. What are some things that you might invite people in who want to learn more?
Yeah, new book, Combining. And I have 2 big training sessions that are open for application and registration right now. The in-person one is in Singapore, which is really exciting because it's I'm going to be there working with a bunch of schools. And so the kids are wanting to start to take part in this. And I'm looking forward to that. So if you are in Asia, this is a time when you don't have to come all the way across to this side to do the warm data training, which is a big course. It's a week-long, deep theoretical piece with lots of story. There's a couple people in this room who've been through it. Then the other one is an online one that starts in April. So those are both, if you just Google Warm Data Lab, you'll come up with the training reg.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. So we'll go back to some more questions. Jose?
Good.
Yeah.
Thank you again, Nora. It's a pleasure seeing you and hearing you again. How do we communicate this? I love your poetic language, but I also know that people like myself struggle to connect with that language in a way that is more common to us. So how do we communicate this in a way that more people can hear it, in a way that becomes more mainstream, if you will?
I mean, I think the first thing to do is to do it at home. That communication is a practice. The perception is a practice. And I think a lot of people start with complexity theory or systems theory, and it's big and it's over there. And I think if there's anything that I have learned in my life is that understanding complexity theory or systems theory or these things as theoretical processes that can be applied to solution making, strategy making, is a disaster. So there's a way in which you can talk about that stuff, and the abouting is got its own flavor, but until your response and your perception of relational transcontextual process is so personal that you see it at your breakfast table, you see it in relationship to your spouse in a really hard moment, that you're able to respond to your kid having trouble with math, not with a first order solution. Right? The first order solution is, well, you have to fix your math grade. You're gonna fail if you don't do well, so you have to do better. And then you learn, oh yeah, but actually spending a weekend with your 95-year-old grandmother and learning about care and being around death, and suddenly that math looks different. So watching how different contextual processes are shifting each other, and we are not trained to do that. Okay, so when you say the poetic part is difficult, I'm going to say yes, it is. Right? In the 60s, people took LSD and they had, sex with different types of people, and they believed in different religions, and they blew all the doors of the ossified culture. And in this moment, none of those things are going to do us any big change. They're not going to make any big explosions of thought. But
Communicating
moving
into
into,
living.
but if you communicate and you start to move around how to respond beyond first order, that's radical. That's super radical. So I invite you to take it home first. Before you think about how to make it go viral, just take it home, just practice. Because I think that's the main thing. And then your voice will change as you perceive the world differently. What you say, you will say differently. The communication that comes out of that, that's a consequence of a shift in perception. It's not a script that we can devise or a methodology.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Rose.
Thank you. Nora, this was wonderful. I'm a poet. Whatever you're saying resonates with me. And similar to Jose's question, we live in a world where perhaps some of your ideas are seen as radical. You use that word. Impractical. I'm being provocative here because I'm struggling with it as well. And so what can tend to happen is that if you are, someone that's open to this, it becomes very lonely because, you don't have a community. There's a community here that's certainly interested, but the risk is, and I'll talk about myself. This is my own. I tend to then, okay, I'm not going to talk to too many people about this. I'm going to write about it in a journal. I'm going to reflect. It's going to be inner work. And so it's always that tension about, well, no, I have to tell people about this. I need to talk about it, but no, it's too hard. It's just, it can be demoralizing sometimes. It's personal. People attack you. So I don't know how can you share some of your learnings in that kind of process, or is it just me going through this?
No, it is not just you. But thank you, because it's a sensitive spot, and absolutely I get underestimated all the time. And people make the mistake of thinking that I don't know the theory I'm talking about. I know the theory that I'm talking about. And if you want, we can talk in jargon. I don't want to talk like that, though. I don't want to be communicating about. And I think increasingly I have found in the last couple of years, really, it was a phony poesis that set me free. That piece of theory, if you get the book, or if you actually, that paper is, I think, published in a couple of journals, so you can find it. But that piece of theory was the one where I started to realize there are unseen coalescent processes that are actually forming the premises of who we are and how we respond. And those unseen coalescings are forming the basis of corruption, racism, sexism, greed, all sorts of the sort of insidious issues that are woven in to every single issue that needs to be addressed right now if our species is to survive. So those pieces, you can't just reach out and grab them. They are in the underground. You can't find the way that they're connecting. It's like that violin piece, right? So where is it? It's in between them, and it's forming in ways that you can't shine a light on and find. So I guess what has happened for me, Rose, is that I simply cannot violate that. that's what happened. Eventually, I just couldn't violate those processes that I saw producing vitality, and that communicating that in flat prose and descriptions becomes violent. So I found that really I needed story and poetry in relationship to prose to be able to hold it in a way that, well, actually, that was honest. So is it lonely? Absolutely. And do I get misunderstood and dismissed? Absolutely. But oh well, that's okay. Yeah. Dave, go ahead.
Oops. Yeah, gorgeous to hear your words. I think there's the degree of embodiment that you exemplify in terms of encompassing complexity, the complexities inherent in existence. I kind of think Jose asked the question I was going to ask, so I'm just going to acknowledge what I'm hearing. But there's a beauty and the exquisite attention that and ways of describing how ecologies work, I think kind of reaches really, really deep into, as I'm hearing it, it reaches really deep into my soul to hear these expressions. And we were talking in the breakout group about paying attention to one another in this way of all the multi-dimensional aspects that you're bringing that are kind of edited out of modern communication or just day-to-day communication. And so this notion of combining these different contexts, I think I just find really elevates. But the thing I was wondering about, our ability to give exquisite attention and express this is somewhat, we're in still somewhat convenient circumstances whereby that's still possible. But should the ecological crisis take further exponential leaps, that may our ability to do that may be impaired. So I suppose I had a question around that. I'm not quite framing it very well.
Well, yes. Dave, that's why I am working as tirelessly as I possibly can. And I invite you to come take the warm data course with me. Let's do this, because every moment that I mean, there's a call for community, right? The poly crisis is that is our era, is so far beyond the possibility of any of our institutions to respond to. It's not even possible, because the mental health, for example, is inextricable from economic and ecological and cultural and familial strife. Okay, and yet the health industry can only deliver in one context. Okay, our economic issues are based in all sorts of notions of identity, of technology, of media, of history, of culture, et cetera, and yet that it's not really about dollars and cents or currencies that are shifting. You can't change poverty by actually adding money. Money just goes right back up. Right. So every single situation that we are looking at right now requires a completely different approach. And one of the what I see as being the centermost pendings here is people on the ground. Can they actually meet a crisis together? because the question for me is not how do we get, the solutions. The question is, how do we help people to be able to help each other? And how is it possible for that helping to help? Because you see already, that's third, we're already doing multiple orders there. I'm not helping you. I'm helping you be able to help other people.
Yeah.
Without saying how, because I don't know how. I don't know what you will face. I don't know if it will be fascism. I don't know if it will be war. I don't know if it will be a lack of water or a loss of food. I don't know if it will be mental health issues, or I don't know, right? But I do know that these polycrises are moving their way right into every household at this point in one form or another. And they keep getting identified as problems that the individuals have produced by making bad choices. So we have to fix the individuals so they can go back into the system that's creating the polycrises. So yeah, I think we cannot have that kind of community without first communing.
Yeah.
And so that's where everything that I want to do right now is really on that place of, okay, let's tend the possibilities of communing, because as far as I can see, that's all we got. The rest of it is going to have to sort itself out from there. But if everybody hates each other, there's no model in the world you can implement. Well, I mean, I'm watching people creating all these crazy save the world models, and I'm like, you can't do that. These guys, they cannot agree on vegan or non-vegan. They cannot agree on, they can't have a conversation about half the things that are going on in the world. Like we can't have a top-down model when people are not communing, which really means mutual learning. So yeah, that's kind of where I am with that. And
just great to hear you pour that out, and great to hear you state that, and recognize the truth of it. Just thank you.
Yeah.
So I just want to, and this is not in disagreement. It's actually in agreement, but it's a way people may process some of these messages. And I'll struggle with this idea. It's this idea that if we have control of nothing, it gives us an excuse to do nothing. Or if we are communing, we feel better, so we don't have to actually do the combining. We can stay safe because we feel better about it. I know you're not saying those things.
No, not at all. On the contrary,
Zombie cat.
yeah, it's actually a much it's rigor. Actually, it's a lot of integrity and responsibility and rigor of paying attention.
The craft of combining and the vulnerability of combining is really maybe what the urgent need. And ignore those things because it's too easy for us to stay in our compartmentalized spaces. And
Right. So I see someone said we can have a top-down model, but it's accompanied by authoritarian control, which then turns into revolution. It doesn't take very long before that happens. I want to leave you guys with a poem. I know we're at time, and I'm not sure. Do you have a favorite, Tom?
Oh, no, I do not.
I actually have
one on vulnerability and combining, if there is one.
I have a question.
Okay.
If that leads to a poem.
Okay.
So
go ahead.
The question is, theory brings embodiment, and embodiment brings theory. Or so. And when people are stuck doing only one, how do you help? And is there anything that is helping?
Well, actually, this is not the poem I was going to read, but I'm going to read it now. So what I want to end with, is an invitation for you to enter sense making in new ways. Okay. The importance of synesthesia right now. The recognition that the way we have come to understand our senses is only one possible way. And this is super important. I did a course once with a bunch of Reggio Emilia teachers, and they were planning a week on food. And they had for these little kids, 4-year-old kids, an exercise that they were going to have to do the next morning. And the teachers had to do it the night before to try it out. And the exercise was that there were all these fresh herbs on the table. And then there, like basil and oregano and whatever, mint, coriander. And the exercise was to draw the smell. Okay. So the teachers had a really hard time. They were like, ooh, draw the smell. Ooh, what does the smell look like? What color is it? Right. But the kids the next day, they sat right down to it without one bit of hesitation. So I'm inviting you into synesthesia because this question of actually how to perceive in new ways is really interesting, when the way we perceive is perceiving what we're familiar with. These exercises where there's a gorilla that runs through the room or something and no one sees it because they couldn't see it, because they weren't looking for it, so they didn't see it. So what is possible to perceive is not really only what's there. So the practice of ecological thinking, I think, begins with working with your perception. So I'm going to read you a really sweet poem that has nothing to do with the end or the beginning of the world or change making or anything like that. But actually it has everything to do with that. And this piece is called The Caramels of Autumn. Butterscotching birch trees and honeying maples, in their confection perfection, for a few soft taffy hours. They cherry in candied red at the forest edges. The landscape is sugar shined in dampness. Tilled wet earth as heavy as acres of chunky melted chocolate waits. Apple green grass glows in sour, snappy light, while cola bark trunks and branches gum and crunch. Milky Earl Grey sky pours from porcelain, so Saturday sweet. So I want you to just notice the synesthesia and the invitation to perceive through other contexts of experience. Let those contexts re-inform each other, reshape, and make new forms. And I think in that there is the possibility for all sorts of understanding, insight, and more importantly, compassion.